Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first edition of the May Demand Driven Month. We thank you, everyone, for taking the time for joining us. Alex Donoso, he will get an introduction of the band. Alex, please.
Hola, muy buenos días. Bienvenidos a todos. Un gusto que nos acompañen en este primer evento del Demand Driven Month para Latinoamérica. Vamos a dar con el inicio al mismo, con la presencia de Carol Ptak, que nos va a brindar una apertura bastante interesante al modelo. En este sentido, contarles también que este evento busca tener la oportunidad de compartir experiencias, casos de éxito, entrenamientos, aspectos de diferentes tipos de recursos que construye el mundo del Demand Driven. Y con todo ello, dejarles una contribución para que puedan iniciar en este maravilloso mundo de lo que es la planeación y modelos avanzados del Demand Driven. Adelante, Bruno.
Muchas gracias. Voy a hacer una introducción en inglés también. Gracias a todos por su tiempo. Bueno, Carol, I'm going to present Carol and introduce her webinar. Today we are going to be your host, Alex and me, and we're going to present Carol's webinar. It is called Prerequisites for Adaptive Sales and Operations. It's a brand new content. It is previous to the new release of the new book. I'm going to present Carol Ptak. Carol Ptak is currently a partner with the Demand Driven Institute. She is a co-founder of the Demand Driven Institute. She is the only woman that has been president of the SAPIX, that is now known as the AECM. Carol Ptak is a demand-driven thought leader and co-founder of the DDI, and Carol has written several books in the operations management field. Carol, the stage is yours, please.
Thank you so much, Bruno. I really appreciate being invited, and I always feel like I have to say, lo siento mucho, hablo inglés solamente. So I do apologize. It is going to be in English. That's all I got. So let's get right to it. What is adaptive sales and operations planning? Well, let's look at the definition. It's not supply-demand balancing. Adaptive sales and operations planning is an integrated business process. Right? This is management's handle on the business and allows them to strategically direct the business to achieve a competitive advantage on a continuous basis. Well, how? Well, the focus is the protection, the promotion of ROI. It's all about return on investment. So as we look at how adaptive S&OP works, we're going to look at our product innovation, our customer-focused product marketing plans for both new products and existing products. We've got to consider our operations strategy and our financial strategy. And this is not just a once a quarter or once a month event. This is a continuous basis done by an integrated reconciliation team that enables our company management to do three very critical things, which is to sense changes in the marketplace, adapt, and innovate successfully across their supply chain. So to be able to do this, what are the prerequisites? And as Bruno mentioned, these are coming out of a new book that we're working on with Dick Ling. Dick is the father of sales and operations planning. And now with the advent of Demand Driven, Dick's vision for S&OP that he had in 1985 is now becoming a reality. We're very excited about this new work that's coming out, and it should be in the market by fall, we hope. So what are the prerequisites? Well, first, we need to understand what's called the VUCA world and how complex adaptive systems work. Second, we have to have a commitment to some kind of a flow-based efficiency. Third, we need to implement some form of flow-based operating model. Fourth, We have some kind of a tactical adaptive loop. And fifth, we have to have a defined strategic direction. So let's think about the VUCA world. We were just talking about this just before we came on. The latest pandemic is one of only the latest that we've had of crises. Everybody seems to think that this is the only crisis that we've ever faced. But in my country, 9/11 closed our borders, stopped all international trade. We had a SARS epidemic. We had the 2008 housing crisis. We've had hurricanes around the world. We've had tsunamis around the world. So as we look at our world today, we can see it's volatile. And the frequency and the severities of these disruptions is increasing. It's no longer a question of if something's going to happen. It's all about when. And the other problem is it's uncertain. It's trying to predict when these events will happen is getting more and more difficult. We always know that there's three truths about forecasting. One is forecasts are always wrong to start with. Second, the further out into the future, the more wrong they are. And third, the more detailed we try to get, the more wrong we are. So here we're trying to forecast into the future, and we've wasted billions of dollars trying to get more accurate forecasts about something that is totally uncertain. We also know that our supply chains are becoming more and more complex. Our supply chains today have more connections and more interdependencies. And this was finally discovered during the most recent COVID pandemic, as we could not get personal protection equipment around the world, and how quickly supplies in the grocery stores disappeared. And companies found out really where their supply chains were. I remember just 2 years ago, if I said to somebody on an airplane, they asked me, what do you do for a living? And I said, I do education for supply chain management. And you got that glazed over look where people would say, what's that? Well, now we don't have to explain supply chain to anybody anymore. Everybody knows what supply chain is. You listen to the news, and in a 1 hour broadcast, you'll hear the word supply chain 10 or 20 times. But our supply chains have changed. Supply chains have elongated, which means that we've now stretched these things around the world as we source and sell globally. Supply chains have become much more fragmented. We have many, many, many more nodes, more inputs. And so trying to manage that integration is more difficult than it ever has been. And our supply chains have become much more fragile. Even a small event, something as small as a fire in a plant someplace, can shut down Ford Motor Company's F-150 truck assembly plant. So even a small event can have devastating effects across the supply chain. The other thing that we've had is that they're becoming more ambiguous. So we don't even know not only what's going to happen, we don't know what's really happening today. So what we've got is it's becoming more and more difficult. We don't even know what city that is on the left. That could be New York, it could be Paris, it could be Bogota, it could be Mexico City. We don't know because we can't see clearly. But at the same time, we're drowning in data, but we're starving for relevant information. And so executives are very frustrated. So how do we look ahead and how do we move forward? Well, first, leadership has to start with one big assumption, and that is that the kinds of disruptions that we've seen are going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's clearly a matter of when. And second, we cannot build business and supply chain models based on profit maximization strategies that ignore the above conclusion. As the pandemic first started to roll out, what happened was I was on lots of calls with lots of executives, and they're saying, when we get back to normal, and I said, this is your new normal. And it's like a cancer survivor. You become a cancer survivor the day that you have your cancer surgery, but your life's forever changed. The world forever changed as this pandemic started to roll out around the world. When the pandemic really started to roll out, I was actually in Bogota, Colombia. Never crossed my mind not to go to Bogota. And I was in Bogota doing a demand-driven leader class. And I discovered as I was leaving Bogota on the last night of class, and I had a very late night flight, about 1:45 to midnight. And I didn't discover until I landed in Houston that I was the last flight out of Bogota before Colombia closed her borders. Had I not been on that flight, I would have been enjoying the hospitality of the Colombians for the next 7 weeks, as they didn't allow anybody in or anybody out. So we know large disruptions are going to happen. And as we look at our company's strategy, we cannot ignore that fact. We are not going to go back to 2019. We don't get to hit the reset button like you do in a video game and start over again. So how do we add this idea of this VUCA world, this volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world, to this thing called complex adaptive systems? Well, let's talk a little bit about what it is that we're really trying to manage. We're trying to manage a system that is what's called nonlinear. It's not a straight line. You know, we'd love to think of supply chains as chains. And in fact, supply chains are actually not named correctly. They're not chains at all. They're nonlinear networks. So there's a lot of dynamic interactions with high degrees of interdependency across this multidimensional structure, which means what? There's extreme sensitivity. You can get a lot of small initiating events that happen in a very short time that produce a very nonlinear outcome that becomes extreme events. It's called the butterfly effect, which means that what? There's a disproportionate cause and effect. Something that's small that happens might have a huge impact. For example, a part that costs 10 cents can quickly halt the assembly of a multi-million-dollar end item as quickly as a $10,000 part. I always love it when people say to me, well, it's just a C part. Well, I was in aerospace for a while, and I remember we had a $500,000 interior we were trying to get out for Air India, and purchasing forgot to order the C parts. Well, here's a $500,000 interior waiting on a bunch of screws, bolts, nuts, and washers. And it was crazy. I had to go down to the local hardware store and get them. Now, adaptive. So it's complex and adaptive. Now, adaptive means how that system changes. And here's the problem with a complex adaptive system. It doesn't stay in any steady state too long. As soon as you put any pressure on it, it changes and morphs. Let's just look back at the last year to see the kind of changes that we've seen. Normally, this kind of conference would be done face-to-face, and we would all have a wonderful time getting to see each other and talk to each other and network. But now, the virtual world has become the expectation. And so the good news is now you've got presenters from all over the world that can bring the brightest and the finest ideas to this kind of an event. The bad news is we don't get to see each other. So adaptive, we've had to adapt to the outer pressure. So how does a complex adaptive system change? Well, it does through 3 things. First, there's an emergence. Okay, there's new ideas that come out. It's a reconfiguration of the system. Look at the educational system, how we quickly move from face-to-face education to virtual education, and how quickly that happened. Feedback is that set of signals and triggers that are monitored by people. We call these people adaptive agents because it's the only things that can change a system is the people. So that feedback, how do I know where I'm going? Think of it as driving a car and you're monitoring your speed, but it only has context if you know what the speed limit is, what the conditions of the road are, and what the capability of your vehicle is. And then third is selection. How do we decide what is it that we're going to do? Well, that selection is the decisions, actions, and learning in response to those signals and triggers. Now, as adaptive agents, we do this by choice. Now, we've known about adaptation for a long time. And it's always interesting. People, one of the places I really is on my bucket list that I really want to go to is Ecuador, because I want to see where all the work was done around the theory of adaptation. Now, most people call it the theory of evolution that Darwin did. Darwin never said that. It was adaptation. And in Mother Nature, it's done so cataclysmically, because if you don't adapt, well, then you die. And the reality is the same for companies today. We have really only 2 choices. We learn how to adapt or we die. Well, how do you adapt? We adapt through this sequence of feedback of emergence, selection, and feedback loops. Well, what does this got to do with sales and operations planning? Let's look a little bit more about complex adaptive systems. As we look at managing a complex adaptive system, we need coherence. We've known this for a long time, that we've seen departmental behavior, what we call silo management, where each department behaves by itself. Well, in a complex adaptive system, we need to look at what is the overall objective of the whole system and how do we bring alignment and coherence to that objective. So first thing that we have to do is we have to establish a boundary. In reality, all the systems are interconnected, and those systems are connected to other systems, and those systems are connected to other systems. And I don't mean computer systems, I mean our supply chains. But we have to draw some boundary around that which we can manage. Now, there's something that's called the edge of chaos, is that as I manage, as things start to change and morph, which they will, they go to a more and more disintegrated state, all right, and we get to the edge of chaos. So that's that sort of boundary between where things are in this happy equilibrium and total chaos or collapse. The signals is how we communicate within the system, and the signal strength is part of that communication protocol, because we need to understand what the priority is. The closer we get to the edge of chaos, the higher the priority. And at the feedback loop, we need to have relevant information so that we can judge the system and the subsystem performance. And the adaptive agents are the people that interpret, learn, and react to signals. Well, we've known this for a while. This was first published in the book Demand Driven Performance, written by Chad and Deborah Smith back in 2014, 7 years ago. So what is the success factor? This is something else that we hear on the news all the time. We see a lot of the analyst firms writing about, is that the concern now is supply chain resilience. There's really two things. There's robustness and resilience. Robustness is how much pressure can a supply chain take before it breaks. Resilience is its ability to maintain or restore system equilibrium through the kind of large shocks that we know are coming. Again, not a matter of if, it's when. And how do we have a supply chain that's resilient? So, coherence. What's the overall system objective? What's the focus? Well, let's take a look at the adaptive loops that we use in the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. And we're going to have a presentation later this week on the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. But you can see that there's two adaptive loops. There's a tactical adaptive loop and a strategic adaptive loop. An adaptive S&OP provides that emergence of ideas that's then selected by DD-S&OP and provides feedback. Well, that feedback comes back for adaptive S&OP to then participate in the selection of strategy, where the company is going. The tactical adaptive loop comes out of DD-S&OP with emergence of ideas that's fed to the demand-driven operating model, and then the selection's done and the feedback so that we understand the choice and the consequences of those choices. It's no longer trust me, it's based on that choice. Here's the consequence. So what is it all about? What do we want coherence on? It's all about flow, our second prerequisite. When we know flow is occurring, we know some things happen. We know that service is consistent and reliable. We know that. Two, we know that when we have good service, we're going to maximize and protect our revenue, and we're going to minimize our inventory. Well, that's interesting, because everything that we've been taught about inventory states that to have better customer service, I have to have more inventory. Here I'm telling you, when I have good flow, I have better revenue and lower inventories. Well, that's because it really truly is all about flow. As I focus on flow, anybody that's had any experience in any lean manufacturing knows this to be the case. That as things flow better, our expenses go down, our inventory goes down, and our on time and full goes up. And that our cash flow follows our rate of product flow to our market demand. All critical things for a company, especially as we go back to what it is that we're focused on. Return on investment. It's not about cost minimization. You know, it's funny, I've been all around the world and offered to many executives that I'd be happy to take their company for 6 months and I'd be able to return their cost down to zero. And I've never had any of them take me up on it because they recognize that if the costs are at zero, it means the company's out of business. Our focus is really about how do we maximize our ROI, our net profit divided by our investment. So flow is not new. You know, the Demand Driven Institute didn't come up with this. Demand Driven Latin America didn't come up with this. It has been around a long time. Here's our forefathers of material requirements planning. From the left, Joe Ehrlicke. In the center, Ollie White. The guy on the right side, George Plazel. When you really look at what is MRP all about, it's about synchronizing demand with supply. That's the job of MRP. Well, lean, and we have Taiichi Ono here. If I ask anywhere in the world what the objective of lean is, I get the answer that it's to reduce waste. Well, just like Darwin never said theory of evolution, Ono never said the objective of lean was to reduce waste. What he wrote about in the original Japanese paper is what he called his river production system. He wrote about flow. And of course, we have our friend Dr. Eliyahu Goldratt, the inventor of the theory of constraints, is understanding that there's some kind of limitation to that flow, and that the overall objective is to improve system throughput, and looking at throughput, investment, and operating expense. And of course, we have to bookend with another American, W. Edwards Deming. Not that we listened to the man, right? We sent him over to Japan, and he's considered the father of Six Sigma. He taught the Japanese about quality, and his whole objective is how do we reduce variability? So the foundation underneath these four disciplines, it's all about flow. And flow is the great unifier for those four. They have the same foundation. It's all about flow. We spent too many years fighting over, or do I do MRP or lean or TOC? And it really should be all about and. How do I do all of this by leveraging the foundation of flow? Now here's something that we call Plazel's Law. Now George, I knew personally, he actually wrote the foreword of my book on ERP. And you never heard George speak that he did not say all benefits are directly related to the speed of flow of materials and information. Now, we've called it Plazel's Law in honor of George. We've added one word to it. All benefits are directly related to the speed of flow of relevant materials and information. Now, is this concept of focusing on flow new? Well, of course not. Let's go back to Frederick Taylor. Frederick Taylor started way back when, and he really transformed our entire world from craftsman-based businesses to mass production. And he did that by being able to break apart the tasks and looking at time standards and variances. Well, who learned from him, would never admit it, was this gentleman named Henry Ford. Henry Ford, his whole objective was to try to build a car so fast and so economical that every American could afford to buy a brand new car. So Ford today still can't build a car as fast as what Henry Ford could in the day. He was fully vertically integrated, right from the iron ore all the way out to final delivery of the vehicle. He really masterminded this idea of mass production. Well, and that leads to another guy, F. Donaldson Brown. Most people have never heard his name. I think in the thousands of people that I've had in classes and in presentations, I think I've only had one or two. And those are people that understood managerial accounting, because Brown is the father of managerial accounting. Many people are familiar with his work while he was at DuPont, where he developed the DuPont ROI model. Well, what he recognized is that the objective is all about the market, and it's about market creation and segmentation. And in a time where the American automotive industry was highly fragmented, Ford had over 80% market share. And within a year after Brown moved into the automotive industry, the doors of the River Rouge plant were closed and Ford had to retool because the market changed. And what Brown brought to the market, because where he hooked up was with Albert Sloan, and they brought something to the market that had never been seen before, this tiny little startup car company called General Motors. And what they brought out, and I always love reading the marketing books, that they say, well, GM won market share because they had color cars. And I always love to ask international audiences if they think Americans are really that stupid, which most of them actually will nod their heads and say yes. But in reality, what Brown brought to the market was the GMAC, the General Motors Acceptance Corporation, that for the first time, you could buy a car on financing instead of having to pay cash. That changed the market, and Ford never regained its market share, failed to adapt. So, but for all three of these guys, what they focused on was flow, not unit cost minimization. Okay, flow was the focus. So flow is the lever. Okay, that's how we get to ROI. As I improve flow, I improve cash velocity. As I improve cash velocity, I've improved my net profit divided by investment. And of course, net profit divided by investment is the formula, always has been, for ROI. So what is flow? How do we define it? I can only improve something that I can measure and define. So flow is the rate at which a system converts material to a product required by a customer. And notice that section that's required by a customer. If I build it and it's still here, that's inventory. Okay, that's investment. It's not flow. Cash velocity is the rate of net cash generation. Now, this is something that comes out of managerial accounting. Well, what is net cash generation? Well, that's our revenue minus our variable cost. Okay, and in managerial accounting, that's known as contribution margin. In the TOC world, it's called throughput. Same thing. Then we have to minus out what our period operating expense is, because that's cash that went out in this period. And of course, our net profit divided by investment is the equation for ROI. So let's go to management accounting. Flow is what's managed. Cost is the outcome of that management. And we lost managerial accounting as we entered the age of MRP2. Ollie White really did not understand the difference between managerial accounting and cost accounting. Cost accounting was mandated by the federal government in the United States in response to Black Friday, October 19th, 1929. Now, as we look at flow and cost, part of that cost accounting that we inherited after Black Friday was called generally accepted accounting practice. So that unitized our cost calculation based on past activity within a defined period. Yeah. So that allowed us to allocate and to look at a 100% accurate picture of history. Now that's different than what I'm trying to manage today. When things flow well through a defined period, then costs are controlled. So as I improve cost performance, it does not improve cash velocity. I have been in part of many companies that think by overbuilding, and according to GAAP, the company looked very, very profitable. The reality is they consumed all their cash and went bankrupt. Cost was never intended to be a decision driver. GAAP was never intended to be the accounting system that managers use. It was managerial accounting that is an entirely different field that is there for managers. GAAP, the creation was to ensure a very transparent and consistent reporting. And we see this now with an international accounting standard that's doing the same thing now worldwide. So, what are some rules for our VUCA world? Remember, we've got Plausel's law. All benefits directly related to the speed of flow. When a business focuses on flow, better cost performance follows. However, if you invert that, that is not the case. A focus on cost will destroy flow. So how do I determine if something is productive? Well, it's productive if, and only if, it leads to better promotion and protection of system flow. So what's efficient? Because efficient and productive are two different things, but they're two different things, they're two sides of the same coin. Something is efficient if and only if it leads to better promotion and protection of system flow, not reduction of unit cost. So that's our embracement of flow. Well, how does this come into a flow-based operating model, something that we call the demand-driven operating model? So let's take a look at the demand-driven operating model schema. What's in there? Now, of course, we've got our friend DDMRP. All DDMRP is a supply order generation engine inside the demand-driven operating model that takes actual demand and then puts out manufacturing orders with request dates, also puts out purchase orders and stock transfer orders. And then what comes back is the promise date from a demand-driven scheduler, which is a finite scheduler on the control point, and the demand-driven execution, looking at managing the buffers. And of course, we need the progression of our manufacturing orders and monitor that. So this is our demand-driven operating model schema. DDMRP is not the whole answer. It is only the starting point. It's a way to get started to embrace a flow-based operating model. But there has to be something that oversees DDMRP and the settings for our control point scheduling. Well, that's a topic of another webinar, and that's demand-driven S&OP. That's that tactical bidirectional reconciliation engine that's part of the full demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. So that sets the model configuration, the choices, and then we see the feedback loop that gives us the consequences of those choices. All right, so we've got the choices and the consequences. So again, it's this closed loop system, this plan, do, check, act, or define, measure, analyze, improve, control. Our emergence, selection, and feedback loop. So let's drill a little bit into DDMRP. And I love it when I travel, people say, I don't believe in it. Well, it's not a religion. It's not a cult. It's a methodology. And it does something very simple. It models, plans, and manages supply chain to do one thing and one thing only: protect and promote the flow of relevant information and materials. That's it. It uses strategic decoupling points, and it creates supply order generation and management of the buffers across the supply chain. Now, is it new? No. It was first printed in 2011 in Orlicky's MRP, 3rd edition, and it wasn't new then. We had been working on it for 15 years. I always love people that call it an overnight success. It's an overnight success that's been about 25 years of our life. Then in 2016, we wrote the book on DDMRP, just focused on DDMRP itself. So what is it? Remember, the foundational pillar, it's all about flow. Don't throw out MRP and DRP and Lean and TOC and Six Sigma. Those are the pillars that DDMRP sits on. It's all about flow. It's not just pure pull, it's position, protect, and pull. I need to take a strategic view of my supply chain to determine where my strategic decoupling positions are. That's the first step in DDMRP. They are sequential. They are in prerequisite order. So the strategic decision, because it determines customer lead time and inventory investment, is where the strategic decoupling buffers are. Then we start to move from the strategic to the tactical as we look at the buffer profiles and levels, and we look at how we dynamically adjust for the capacity that we have within our tactical relevant range. Then the easy part, the operational side. Everybody always wants to jump to demand-driven planning and execution, but the reality is the hard work occurs in the first 3 steps. Demand-driven planning and visible and collaborative execution is highly automated and is a great opportunity for artificial intelligence and machine learning to further adapt the model through what? The emergence, selection, and feedback loop. So what is that tactical adaptive loop? As we look at our adapt side, coming from the tactical and strategic future, remember, this is what's coming through DDS&OP, is that tactical adaptive loop is looking at the where, because that's strategic. It's looking at how much, which is the tactical question. And then finally, the operational. And again, this is the loop. This is an emergence, selection, and feedback loop. So what are the DDS&OP elements? Well, first is that tactical review. Second, tactical projection. Third, our tactical configuration or reconfiguration. Fourth, our tactical exploitation. And fifth, strategic recommendation. So it's all about Pareto. Again, something that goes way back to ancient Venice, Vilfredo Pareto, who said that 80% of Venice's wealth was held by 20% of its citizens. Well, our opportunity for improving our process lies in those 20% that's not on those tails. We need to emphasize our outlier identification and analysis. And instead of ignoring the tails of the Pareto, we need to focus on those so that we can eliminate those outliers and push things to the center. That's relevant information. This is how we adapt this nonlinear complex system. So as we look at our model past performance, we can look at our stock buffers, where we have too much. That's in the little blue box. We can look in the red box where there's too little. We can look at our capacity buffers. If we have too much, it's on the right side there with the red and dark red, which means that there are potentials for becoming a disruption to flow. On the left side, now we've got excess capacity. How can we use that for tactical exploitation? You can see this is a very different way to run a business. We can look at tactical review. Now, instead of managing our company by transactional control, now we can manage our company with process control. Much more powerful. And again, this is what sets up the capability of technology to step in with machine learning and artificial intelligence as it starts to recognize these patterns. So we have this analytical view in DDMRP, which provides us buffer positions over time. Now, the run chart can also depict changing sizes of buffer zones over time. So we now have process control on our business. We can look at our capacity buffer analysis. We cannot insert a capacity buffer into the network. We monitor our capacity. Capacity buffers are the difference between load and capacity. So as we look at the two, we can see that one has much less of a capacity buffer than the other one does, right? And we can see that resource one has much more capacity buffer left available than resource three. Well, can we exploit that some way? As we look at the tactical projection, we're working in the tactical relevant range here. So we're looking out one cumulative lead time into the future. And we're looking to see how is it that we're going to make the best use of the capacity that we have in the tactical relevant range. With very little exception, capacity is fixed. So how do I make the best out of what I have? How do I do things like promotions or plant shutdown? How do I address a supply disruption like the Lunar New Year? How do I cut over to a new manufacturing process? Severe weather. All of a sudden, I've got storms that have come in, an ice storm that's going to shut my plant down. And as I look at my lead times and my loads, I can see very clearly that my lead time to promise anything should be in about the 23rd, 24th, because that's when my capacity becomes available. As I looked at my tactical configuration and reconciliation, all right, this is based on my tactical review. Okay, remember, this is one of the prerequisites for adaptive S&OP. How can I bidirectionally tactically reconcile? So it's based on our tactical review, our tactical projection, and any known strategic initiatives. So this is what goes back to our demand-driven operating model using our master settings, not a master schedule. There's very few things that did not come forward into demand-driven. One is a master production schedule. Think about what that is. It's a statement of what I can and will build. Well, where's the customer in that? Instead, we use master settings so that you can build capability to build what you can and will sell. Big difference. So, tactical exploitation. Remember, our capacity within our tactical relevant range is fixed. So how can I exploit that capacity to maximize my cash flow, which maximizes my net profit divided by investment? So DD-S&OP, this tactical reconciliation, one of the prerequisites for adaptive S&OP, brings this translation of what's available from a short-range supplement to add revenue to the company, profitable revenue to the company, and at the same time not disrupt those products that are generating the highest contribution margin per unit of our constrained capacity. So tactical exploitation requires that visibility to the DDOM capability. It's not about a master schedule. It's about managing capability to maximize net profit divided by investment. The DD&OP team is really our tactical integrated reconciliation team. We've given them the car, we give them the keys to the car, they drive it and they maintain it. That's their job. And they're responsible for managing those variable costs within the tactical range. Because remember, our fixed costs are fixed, and holding them accountable for fixed costs is not only not relevant, it's devastating. As we look at strategic recommendations, now this tactical integrated reconciliation team, this DD&OP team, is a cross-functional team. It has people from supply chain, it has people from sales, it has people from marketing, it's got people from engineering that understand what is it that the market's been asking for, and now how is it that the company can now deliver that? What's new opportunities? But it's outside of their realm of authority, so they have to go to senior management. So DD&OP team has the best ability to make a very good justifiable case for that change and relate the options, choice, consequence, because we need to look at both our tactical and our strategic metric objectives. So let's look at the last prerequisite for adaptive S&OP, and that's we have a strategy. What is our strategy? Where are we going? Too many executives believe that all they can do is react to what the market's doing to them. But instead, we need to figure out where is it that our company's going? What is our desired future? And like a sailboat, sometimes we have to make left turns and right turns, but we got to keep our eye on the goal, because as the world changes, we may need to tack and make different kinds of changes and how we're going to get there, but clearly keeping our eye on the goal. Adaptation is absolutely essential and necessary. So management drives the process. The strategic direction is how are we going to innovate to sustain and grow our market pull? How is it that we're going to go to market and make the market interested in us? That's what market-driven innovation is all about. So management needs to consider things like, well, what does the economy look like? What should our portfolio look like? You know, I was just reading the news, Verizon is getting rid of some of the products out of its portfolio. What are the economic factors that are affecting us? You know, as we look at the impact of the pandemic, as the government's continued to shut down businesses, you know, that is a huge economic factor. Many businesses aren't going to survive. But on the other hand, there's been lots of new businesses that have been created in the last year that have adapted to this new world that we're living in. What's going to be our market share? Just to say we've grown by 20% was interesting, but what does that mean? Well, if the market's been growing by 40%, we're actually falling behind. As we look at, okay, what do we do to enhance it? How do we get better market share? How is it that we can understand what the customer really wants? And how is it that we can uniquely serve the needs of that market? When I was teaching at the university, I always told my students, your only source of competitive advantage to exploit your unique operational capability to provide value to the customer at a profit to yourself. That is your only sustainable competitive advantage. That's it. There's lots of things that you can do in the short term to make your bottom line look good, but to be sustainable, it's all providing value to the customer at a profit to yourself. So you need to focus on what makes your company unique. And then how do we review strategy? Just like that sailboat, how do we tack? How do we understand what changes are required? When do we need to change into a different area? You know, as I came off the road last March, it's hard to believe I've been home for 14 months. At the point I came off the road, 100% of our educational products were done face-to-face. Within 2 weeks, our entire network shifted to 100% virtual classes. What changes are required? All of a sudden, we had everybody home. So we needed to provide an opportunity for people to be able to do education. And that's where I applaud Demand Driven Latin America for putting together a full conference that's online. This is part of that adaptation and the change of strategy. So what customers, what territories, what channels should have priority? That's part of our strategy. So you might be asking, well, Gee, this is a very different view of sales and operations planning. I always thought sales and operations planning was looking at, collection of data, figuring out supply, figuring out demand, having a pre-S&OP meeting and an S&OP meeting. Well, it's not. But there are some things that haven't changed. Well, there's still a very strong portfolio management and new activities process involved in adaptive S&OP. There's still this integrated reconciliation process, and in fact, there's two. There's a tactical integrated reconciliation process and a strategic integrated reconciliation process. There's a strong financial integration, trying to bring back managerial accounting. Remember, GAAP is for reporting to the outside world. Managerial accounting is how we make decisions. So we want this strong financial integration. We must document our assumptions. This is something that's very difficult to do, and I shudder when I look at 99% of the sales and operations planning software out there, because all they've done is created another optimization engine, much like APS. But the numbers are meaningless without the assumptions under those numbers. And what has not changed? This is senior management's handle on the business. So what has changed? Well, now we're focused more on aggregate planning rather than a SKU-based forecast. So at the same time, forecasting gets better, and at the same point, on the flip side, it's become less important. Very common question we get asked is, how accurate does the forecast have to be? Plus minus 40, 50%, you're good enough. What's changed is this DD-S&OP process, something that Dick Ling calls the missing link. We never had the ability to do a bi-directional tactical reconciliation because on the strategic side, we had a range. On the operational side, we had a number by date, by quantity, called the MPS. Well, now when we move from the MPS to now move to decoupling positions with buffers and dynamic adjustments to that buffer, we now have a range of capability and operations, which means that now we can bidirectionally reconcile the range from the strategic side to the range from the operational side. That's called DD-S&OP. This bidirectional process enables a company to become adaptive because of that adaptive engine inside the demand-driven operating model. Remember, the emergence, selection, and feedback loop. So how do I successfully implement adaptive S&OP? First, can't stress it enough, education, education, education. It's as a team. It's very difficult. You can't do S&OP education as a public class. All right, this is why we're spending all the time and effort at writing this book, so that to provide that class. That there has to be an understanding of the fundamental principles that are needed to support the adaptive S&OP, which is the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. You're going to be hearing a lot of presentations this week about parts of that demand-driven operating model and the demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. The adoption of the 7 elements. There's 7 elements in adaptive S&OP. And learn by doing. You're never going to get it perfect. It's about doing and changing and doing and changing and doing and changing and learn by doing. One of the biggest traps that companies fall into is thinking that they have to wait until they have the perfect plan and then implement it. Well, you're never going to get a perfect plan. Your best is to start by doing. And then having the appropriate tools, which right now we're in a very interesting time. It's amazing to me how many people in the demand-driven community are really old. Now, why do I say that? Well, I'm one of them. I should be retired at my age. But I see people like myself and many others around the world that should be retired, and we haven't. Why? Because this is the most exciting time in supply chain. Because now we have the need, we have the methodology, and we have the tools. And we're in the great reawakening, the great transformation of supply chain as we move to the future, as executives are learning how to sense, adapt, and innovate. And constantly self-assess. Your company's going to get better and better and better. And we only can do that if we measure. We have to have relevant metrics, flow-based metrics that help us throughout their implementation. So you don't just implement adaptive S&OP. Everybody wants to start there. Unfortunately, you can't. Your first step, implement DDMRP, then get a full demand-driven operating model, then implement sales and operations fundamentals. I go back to the original book that Dick Ling wrote. It's still relevant. It's called Orchestrating Success. That book is as relevant today as it always has been. Matter of fact, it's funny, last year when I was on my trip to Bogota, that was the book I still had in my briefcase, and I read it again to make sure that we hadn't missed anything in the new book outline. All we've done is taken Dick's S&OP to the next level, because now we have this demand-driven operating model and we have the technology to do it. Improve your current S&OP process, and then as you get your DDOM up and running, enable DD-S&OP. That DD-S&OP connection is critical. It's crucial to the whole process, because that helps us enable and achieve that bi-directional communication, and our company becomes adaptive. The more adaptive we are, the more resilient we are. The more resilient we are, the more we can withstand the kind of changes and disruptions that are coming our way. So S&OP is crucial. To be honest, when Chad and I wrote the book DDMRP in 2016, we looked at each other and we said, we're done. Time to go retire. We're finished. But we really pretty quickly realized that the rest of it wasn't obvious, and we had to continue to write, which we have been doing for the last 5 years. To understand that where most companies are around the world is we're trapped. We're trapped between cost reduction and responsiveness. We need to make that first big step. We need to get the education to get our company to step to that flow-based operational efficiency and move away from cost-based operational efficiency. Then implement our demand-driven operating model. All right, this is the first level where we can be called the demand-driven enterprise. Then bring in our sales and operations planning. This is a very well understood, well documented, well supported methodology as we're stepping through this. And then finally, get to the point where you're sensing, adapting, and innovating across our supply chain. And now what we're doing is continually improving our ROI. And we have a full, mature, demand-driven adaptive enterprise model in place. And you're going to hear some case studies in this month, this demand-driven month that our Demand-Driven Latin America has put together. Listen to those case studies. Listen to the practitioners, what they've learned as they move through these steps. I want to thank you very much. I still have a few minutes for questions, and I want to thank you very much. And again, I want to thank our Latin American team. I so miss them that I can't see them in person, but it's so great to be invited to be part of this webinar. So I'm open for questions. Does anybody have any questions? You can ask Espanol. We have our folks that are fluent in Spanish, or you can type it in English, and I'm very happy to answer anything that you may have. I want to thank you again. Like I said, this is a very exciting time in supply chain to be here with the methodology, the technology, and the need. So Bruno,
Muchas
Alex,
gracias.
we got any questions that are queued up?
Thank you, Carol. I'm going to speak in Spanish. Por favor, si nos pudieran ayudar, si tienen algún tipo de pregunta, en el panel que ustedes tienen en el lado derecho o arriba de en el GoToWebinar, en el panel, hay alguna icono donde ustedes pueden postear preguntas si tuvieran alguna cuestión que quisieran hacer. Tenemos un par de minutos para hacerlo. Mientras tanto,
I think either I put everybody to sleep, or they're all sitting there in stunned silence going, what the heck was that?
No, Carol. I think it is a pretty new topic, and we are very excited about waiting for the new content of this the new book. So hopefully we would have it very quickly. All right.
Well, thanks. We're excited about the new book coming out too. The thing that's driving us crazy is that as we've been moving through more of the sales and operations planning, it's exposed to us where we had some loose ends and we had some lack of coherence and we had some things that we needed to get coherent and change. So it's actually going to cause us to have to go back and update absolutely everything we've written, because S&OP really is the great unifier of how to manage a company. And so just like the evolution of a company on how they manage, it's the same way with writing the books. As we started with DDMRP, and then we've been going through the steps, and we're getting more and more clarity. And this is something as companies start to implement, you'll find the same thing. Is DDMRP is pretty simple, straightforward, well understood, lots of software out there for it. And then all of a sudden you start to realize there's a whole lot more to it.